gosh, thank you, Dr. Nooney. And thanks to the organizers. Excellent. I've been enjoying all of this, so thanks so much. This is a small piece of a larger paper that'll be coming out in Pacific Historical Review this fall. So if you like what you see here. As the 1980s dawned, Japan launched its 5th Generation Computer Systems Project, a national development program for intelligent software and novel computer hardware. Planning began in 1978, and the project officially started in 1982 after its announcement at an international conference in 1981. It ran until 1992, when it was granted an extension to upload its results onto a young World Wide Web, and finally conclude in 1995. Shortly after its launch in 1982, many members of the Western military-industrial complex came to fear that the project would produce true AI and use it to unseat the US as the leader in computer technology and dominate the global economy. The threat of the Japanese 5th generation was thus used to justify the creation of a wave of large-scale AI-focused national computing projects in developed nations around the world. These projects funded much of the AI R&D conducted during the second major boom of AI R&D activity in the 1980s. And I'm sorry, Aaron, but they're real. I'm sorry. It's this is a quick aside. We've got a paper coming out next month where we did a sentiment analysis of contemporary AI news and AI news going back to the 1950s. This is our count from the New York Times, and lo and behold, it maps on pretty well to my boom scheme. So there we go. Yet, while they are typically remembered as partial successes, Japan's 5th generation is regarded in the West as a failure, even a tragedy. For example, AI chronicler Daniel Crevier's evaluation in AI, The Tumultuous History of the Search for Artificial Intelligence, is typical. Whereas DARPA's AI project merely, quote, disappointed its military sponsors, he claims, quote, the Japanese fell far short of their objectives. Subsequent AI histories, such as the late Nils Nilsson's, continue to repeat this evaluation in spirit, if not in letter. Japan's 5th generation, then, is seen as an emblem of the AI winter that descended in the 1990s, whereas the other projects, despite their own technical failures, are not. However, Japanese evaluations of the 5th generation conducted in its immediate aftermath considered it a success, having achieved its technical goals. What's going on here? Is this simple nationalism or something more complex? What was the game being played? Which is to say, what were the rules by which these actors determined categories like success and failure for large-scale national technoscientific R&D projects? I argue the differing evaluations of the 5th generation cannot be understood outside of the rise of neoliberalism and the commercialization of technoscience that began in America in the 1970s and was eventually exported to the rest of the world, including Japan by the late 1990s, when the 5th generation was reinterpreted as a failure there too. Japan rose from utter defeat in World War II to become a strong competitor to US business interests within 3 decades. By the mid-1970s, markets worldwide were overflowing with inexpensive, reliable Japanese cars and consumer electronics. The USA, by contrast, was suffering from an oil crisis, stagflation, and growing structural unemployment. Americans watched the value of the dollar fall by 50% as Japan became arguably the most productive nation on earth and the world's second largest economy. Harvard sociologist Ezra Vogel's image of Japan as #1 articulated a new possibility in the global economic order. Credit for Japan's miraculous rise from the ashes of nuclear devastation was assigned to Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, whose deft steering of the Japanese economy encompassed steel, automobile, consumer electronics industries, as well as computing. Sensing the zeitgeist, Japanese policymakers and bureaucrats turned their attention to farther-reaching, longer-term goals. As historian of technology Tessa Morris Suzuki put it, Japan, having successfully transformed itself into an industrial society, was now to become an information society. but it would do so in a distinctly Japanese way. In the West, the information society is typically equated with neoliberalism, and information technologies are means to, as economist David Harvey has said, accumulate, store, transfer, analyze, and use massive databases to guide decisions in the global marketplace, if not on the global battlefield. Entrance into the information society is achieved through neoliberal reforms designed to reallocate decision-making power from governments to markets, where knowledge is treated as a fungible commodity. And as the economic historian Philip Murawski argues, the commercialization of technoscientific research and development through taxpayer-funded public-private partnerships and other market-friendly mechanisms is the apotheosis of this process. Western AI reflected this with expert systems, which improved on good old-fashioned AI, or GoFi, with Edward Feigenbaum's knowledge is power principle, which delimited machinic reasoning to specific knowledge domains, such as chemistry with the Dendral program or medicine with Meissing. Expert systems were designed to replace human experts with machines that possessed their knowledge. We could talk about that later. Accordingly, allusions to extractive industries are rife within the expert systems literature, wherein the valuable commodity of knowledge must be mined out of their heads painstakingly, one jewel at a time. By contrast, in Japan, the government was the primary mover in transitioning the nation into the information society, while industry only played a supplementary role guided by state actors. Japan, after having played catch-up with IBM for decades, was now finally ready to do computing R&D free from market pressures. Accordingly, MIDI formed a committee in 1978 to lay concrete plans for a computer the Japanese society of the 1990s would require. They envisioned socially beneficial computers, machines that would more evenly distribute the benefits of computing to ordinary people. In the Japanese Information Society of the 1990s, computing would be a state-sponsored public good shared openly, rather than intellectual property to be patented and either licensed to a set of domestic firms, as MIDI had been doing until then in order to catch up with IBM, or spun off at public cost to private actors, as in neoliberal Western regimes of technoscience. Therefore, the fifth-generation computer, rather than free market reforms, was the key to a prosperous Japanese information society of the 1990s. Fifth-generation director Kazuhiro Fuchi led the project in accord with the Mertonian norms of science imported from the US after World War II, meaning it would not pursue the commercial goals of industry, but instead 4 social goals outlined by the committee. First, noting that serious social imbalances had arisen as the largest companies had been the primary beneficiaries of industrialization and computerization, the fifth-generation computer would, quote, increase productivity in low productivity areas. Second, acknowledging Japan's shrinking workforce, it would meet international competition and contribute towards international cooperation economically. Third, recognizing Japan's dependence on imports, it would assist in saving energy and resources. And fourth, anticipating a problem Japan is now well known for, it would help, quote, cope with an aged society. To realize these goals, the fifth-generation computers would need to break free of the, quote, yoke of Western computing, which until then had been dominated by IBM and the serial von Neumann architecture. Seeing this as a bottleneck, the committee committed to a parallel non-von Neumann fifth-generation computer architecture and adopted a fifth-generation logic programming, but not Lisp, the standard AI language in the US, but rather Prolog, an alternative developed in Europe. And this pissed off the US AI people to no end. Feigenbaum hated it. Yet it was not an AI project per se. Jinko Chino, or artificial intelligence as it had been imported from the US, was rejected in favor of Chishiki Jouhou Shorty System, or knowledge information processing systems. Fifth-generation computers were intended to allow non-specialist users to interact naturally with the computer through voice, vision, and images. In the Japanese Information Society of the 1990s, fifth-generation computers would scaffold laypeople into cybernetic assemblages more capable than either human or machine alone, rather than replace them. Because our project is, as Fuchi put it, an effort to create a new age for modern man, it must not be exclusive or closed to outsiders, he said. Foreign researchers were therefore invited to participate, with the results being published in English as well as in Japanese. As Fuchi saw it, international collaboration was, quote, the key to a new world, one differing from the Western information society, not only in terms of visions, values, and scientific norms, but materially in the very hardware and software from which it was to be constructed. Feigenbaum was invited to give a keynote at the 1981 conference in Tokyo that announced the project, where he called for even greater international cooperation. But upon returning home, he immediately began traveling around the USA, giving seminars to raise the alarm about Japan's fifth-generation project. Why? Feigenbaum was operating in a new neoliberal space of technoscientific R&D. He had dedicated himself to reinvigorating AI after its decline in the early 1970s following the failure of GoFi and the withdrawal of military funding as the post-World War II regime of US technoscience gave way to the new commercialized regime where almost anything goes. Recognizing that funders no longer believed in the promise of AI, he would sell them the threat that Japan would realize AI's promise instead. He made his case in The Fifth Generation, Japan's Computer Challenge to the World, co-authored with novelist Pamela McCorduck, author of Machines Who Think. Written for popular audiences, the book made a three-part argument that Japan's fifth generation posed a significant threat. First, expert systems transformed computers from calculating machines that rely on data to reasoning machines that rely on knowledge, pushing the global economy towards a new wealth of nations in which the most powerful nations were no longer those that commanded material resources, but knowledge. Second, Japan, as a nation almost completely devoid of natural resources, had no choice but to, quote, establish a knowledge industry in which knowledge itself will be a saleable commodity like food and oil. Therefore, third, the fifth generation was nothing other than Japan's attempt to take the global lead in the knowledge industry and, quote, therefore become the dominant industrial power in the world. Reframed thusly, the fifth generation ironically became the ultimate neoliberal computing project. Japan threatened to undermine American dominance and disrupt the global economic order by beating everyone else at the game of globalized capitalism with its new computers. The syllogistic power of this argument propelled it around the world, and computing communities throughout the West and even the Soviet bloc used it to garner government funds for their own national AI R&D projects, including the Microelectronics and Computer Technology Corporation, or MCC, DARPA's Strategic Computing Initiative, the SCI in the USA, UK's ALVI project, and the European Strategic Program on Research and Information Technology, ESPRIT, among others, all of which were predicated on the model of government money for firms, for private firms. Journalists took note and described it as the emergence of a global arms race for AI. The competition intensified to the degree that the ALVI director, Brian Oakley, could remark, quote, it's like some sort of warfare. It's strange that we should compete in this nationalistic way. Fast forward to the 1990s. It was certainly a new world, but not the one Fuchi had envisioned. The Cold War had ended in the fall of the Soviet Union, leading to American consolidation of geopolitical power and the so-called end of history in the triumph of liberal democracy and free markets. That the 1980s had been dominated by state-led national economies like Japan and Germany was overlooked as neoliberalism became the new common sense. Commercialized technoscience was ascendant, except in Japan, whose state-led miracle-come-bubble economy was in a state of collapse. Although it was never the goal, Japan's fifth-generation computers had not dominated the global economy. MIDI's evaluations found the project had achieved its technical goals, but Western observers merely noted that it hadn't produced a single commercial product. And though this was never the goal either, it didn't matter. The rules of the game had changed. In the new neoliberal regime of commercialized technoscience, what mattered was securing public funds for private technoscientific R&D conducted through a network of contracts. Results be damned. For example, while the fifth generation concluded with a final international conference and multiple professional evaluations of the project by international teams of computing experts, the strategic computing, strategic computing initiative, as historians Roland and Sheeman put it in their study of the project, did not quite end. It simply disappeared, having vanished from the DARPA budget in 1993. At the close of the 1980s, state-led Japanese computing programs still offered a compelling alternative model to the West. But by the mid-1990s, with the Japanese economy stalled out, the very same system of scientific management that had been praised for its post-war economic success was then equally indicted as an explanation of its stagnation, and Japan undertook rapid and far-reaching neoliberal reforms. And the failure tainted the reputation of AI in Japan for more than a decade. The next generation, University of Tokyo, Japanese AI researcher Yutaka Matsuo says, he said he still believes in the vision and says, "I know there is no what if in history, but my dream is to imagine that if the web had appeared 15 years earlier," this is his book, "Japan would be sitting where Silicon Valley is right now." And to just conclude, I think the fifth generation, what does it mean? What does it stand for now? I think it's a warning about the danger of technocratic hubris, actually. At the height of Japan's economic preeminence, the architects of the fifth generation thought they could anticipate what the Japanese society of the 1990s might look like, and even what technologies were needed to fix its problems. But like most every group of technocrats throughout history, they were more or less wrong. None of them foresaw that by the mid-1990s, the most tangible symbol of Japan's success in the information age would not be the fifth generation computer, but as Morris Suzuki points out, game computers produced by Nintendo, a maker of playing cards and arcade games whose origins go back to the 1880s. Thank you very much.